Hello everyone, welcome back to our House Call series, From Confusion to Clarity. We're continuing our discussion on Follow the Science. Barry, in our previous video, you mentioned that bias is something that's actually really unavoidable. So, to some degree, we all see what we want to see. We see what we already believe to be true. So let's explore how bias can affect our ability to do science, actually, during the pandemic.
Yeah, let me start maybe with an analogy, a legal analogy.
Okay.
So we're in a courtroom and we have a person accused of a crime. Our natural bias is to hope we've got the right person, because if we do, now we're all safe. So given that we have that bias, we go out of our way to make sure that bias doesn't interfere too much and gives that person who's accused a fair trial. So we assume to start with that they're innocent until proven guilty in order to avoid that natural bias. The same thing happens in medicine. We don't like seeing people suffer from a disease, for example. So we want to believe that we can find something to fix that, and we want to believe that whatever we're working on now will be that fix. So we have a bias in terms of hoping that it's the right thing. But in order to counter that bias, we assume we start off with what's called the Null Hypothesis, in which we assume it doesn't work, and we must prove to ourselves, in fact, that it does, and it does so to a sufficient level of safety. Because we don't want emotion to be running the situation completely. We want to study it thoroughly to make sure that it's as efficacious as it can be and as safe as it can be for the circumstances that we're dealing with. So in other words, we want to be cautious, not cavalier. And I think thalidomide taught us that. We didn't realize that unborn fetuses, unborn children, are different than adults. We made assumptions that, were based on really the fact that we didn't know what we didn't know.
I love that saying, we didn't know what we didn't know. A lot of people have the belief that medical interventions have no side effects or risks. Do you think that that's accounting for some of the bias that's interfering with us doing the science?
Well, yeah, we'd like to always think our interventions will always work and without any downside to them. But remember that everybody involved in developing and administering an intervention is human. And they're imperfect. All of us are imperfect. So obviously every intervention we do is also going to be imperfect. So we know that our knowledge is always provisional. It's never complete. We don't know all there is to know. And equally, we know that all 7 billion people on the planet are unique. Even identical twins aren't completely identical. So that means that we have to understand two things. One is that each intervention is going to offer some benefit, more benefit to some people and less benefit to others, and more harm to some people and less benefit to others as well. And there may not be much we can do to prevent that. Some of that may be predictable, and we can try to prevent that from happening, but some of it's going to be random and unpredictable, and that's going to perhaps be unavoidable, that we're going to do some harm. And the second thing is, because no two people react the same way to any intervention, it means that we have to factor that in as well. No two people undergo any intervention exactly the same. So the level of safety and efficacy is going to be different for different people. Eggs are a very nutritious food, but there are people who will die if they eat eggs.
Every body is different, right? Like I've said that before. So in other words, what you're saying, though, if I understand it, it's just you can't avoid any risks or harms for medical interventions, despite the potential benefits that are involved, right? And so we need to weigh the risks. If we're talking about these vaccines or these inoculations, we need to weigh the risks of the efficiency or the effectiveness of it versus any potential harms. And so I know that that's called a risk-benefit analysis. I think you mentioned that before, or benefit versus harm. Is there any way, how do we then make these assessments based on that?
Well, part of it is to realize that there are basically 4 types of interventions in medicine. And we'll talk about the first two first. The first intervention is something where somebody has a disease and we want to cure it. And then the second one is where someone has a disease but we can't cure it. So the cure is not nearly as common as people think. The ability for us to just eliminate a disease is not nearly as common as we'd hoped for it to be. But many times, even though we can't get rid of the disease, we can decrease its impact on our lives. We can make it more tolerable, and that's called palliation. For example, we can palliate rheumatoid arthritis even though we can't necessarily get rid of it. And often often people think palliation only applies to the end of life, but the truth is anytime we do an intervention for a disease that someone already has and we can't get rid of it, we can't cure it, that essentially is palliation.
You know, it's true. Most people see palliative care as something that we do only when we're dying, right? And so, but it's a limited understanding of that, actually. You know, anytime we make something better without curing it, we call that palliative care, right? That's what we're doing. So, in both examples, like cure and palliation, the patient is already suffering from a disease, right? Okay, so if that's the case, does it change things then in terms of assessing the risk-benefit or the benefit versus harm?
Well, certainly, if we already are suffering from a disease, we are going to be more willing to accept a risk or adverse effects than if we don't already have the disease.
Okay.
And of course, the more serious the disease, the more willing we are to tolerate side effects than we are for a less serious disease. So if we have a very serious cancer, we'll accept more risk for that treatment than we will for something fairly benign like plantar warts. Equally, if we have more to lose from a disease, then we're more likely to accept risk than we have less to lose from a disease.
So, but what if somebody doesn't already have a disease? Okay, are they? What's their risk tolerance like in that example? Are they less likely to accept side effects, especially if they're feeling well, and only if they have the risk of developing a disease down the future?
Well, that's why the third and fourth types of interventions are on people who do not already have a disease.
Okay.
They only run a risk of developing a disease, which means there's no guarantee they're going to get the disease, or in fact that they'll live long enough to even get the disease. Now, the third type is one in which we delay getting the disease. We can't necessarily eliminate it, so we can treat someone's high blood pressure, hopefully to delay them having a heart attack in their 50s until they're in their 70s or 80s. But we're never going to be able to promise them they won't get the disease at all. The final type, the fourth type, is true prevention. We give someone a tetanus shot and say, look, you're not going to get tetanus now. It's not that it's going to be delayed, it's that you're not actually going to get it ever. And clearly, that's different than it is with present COVID inoculations, in which we can't make that same promise.
So I wonder why people aren't questioning these inoculations, given the limitations that they have. Like, why are we willing to forgo the testing that was done prior, the normal testing that would be done prior to the release of a classic vaccine?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, because our risk tolerance for the inoculations for COVID should be reduced, given that this is a not fully preventive vaccine like tetanus. It's more of a palliative vaccination. And again, it's given to people who aren't already sick. There's only a potential that they will get sick. And for most people, not very high potential that they'll get very sick at all, let alone die. So at the end of the day, if our risk for developing disease is low, and the risk of transmission is low with the vaccine, then we really, if our risk of developing disease is low and the vaccine does not reduce it completely and doesn't completely reduce our transmission ability, then we probably should have an even lower tolerance for risk, given that the vaccine is more palliative than it is totally preventive.
And so because we're focusing on bias, you know, people, I think, have a bias on how safe and confident we felt with previous vaccines, right? The classic vaccines. We have that bias to that. And so it's sort of that previous bias is making us sort of more in favor of sort of widely just accepting these inoculations without, like, the bias is interfering with that. Would you agree?
Well, I certainly think that the public clearly is very afraid.
Yes.
And when we're afraid, we tend to go into binary thinking, which is either fight or flight. And our flight now is to go to safety. And we have a bias that says, hey, the vaccines in the past have been very safe, they've been very effective, they've been around for many, many decades. So my bias is to be in favor of anything else that we call a vaccine. And we have to recognize that bias exists. And so that bias is also probably playing into the fact that people just accept the present inoculations as being the same old, but in fact they're not really.
You know, I hadn't even factored in bias, really, and that's huge, and I'm very grateful for you bringing that up in this context with this conversation. Do you have any other final thoughts?
Well, I think that there are some similarities between the present inoculations and those previous vaccinations with which we feel so comfortable. But the similarities kind of start with the fact that it's an injection,
yes,
and it ends with the fact that we're hoping to induce an immune response for our immune system. But in between, everything's very different between the classic vaccines and the present inoculations. At present, the inoculations using the mRNA technology, for example, the RNA is played with a bit and then coated in a liquid nanoparticle so that it is kind of invisible to the immune system, which allows that particle to make it to all the cells and then inject the mRNA into various cells in our body, which will then utilize our cellular machinery to produce this spike protein that then is released into the bloodstream, that then will be identified by the immune system, to which it will make antibodies. The thing is, the vaccines are producing a very specific spike protein of the alpha variant. So there's only what we call one epitope, one thing on that the immune system can identify,
yeah,
and so it produces just an antibody to that. But if the variants have a different spike protein, a different epitope, it might not be recognized by the immune system that's been primed for the alpha spike protein, not for the variant spike protein. And so with normal, classic vaccines, there are multiple epitopes, multiple areas that the immune system can identify on the vaccine. And in fact, acquired immunity, when you get the actual virus, there's even more epitopes that the immune system can identify. So there's multiple different ways for the immune system to react. That's probably why kids who have had exposure to many types of coronaviruses have developed antibodies to a number of epitopes that share some similarity, perhaps, with COVID, COVID-2, and that's why they're not getting sick nearly as often as adults are. I'm just a lay person, and I'm sure the majority of our viewers are not in the medical field at all. And so, I'm going to re-listen to this part again, actually, to get a deeper understanding, because, no wonder people are confused, honestly. We've never had to think about science this way. Yeah, and I've been confused and still am confused about, we know, and we'll get into this later, that there are false positives for the PCR test.
Yes, yeah.
And I've been wondering, when people are admitted to hospital with symptoms suggestive of COVID-19 and they've had a positive PCR test, is there another test that's done in hospital that's a gold standard that will confirm that it is a true positive as opposed to a false positive PCR test? Have we been able to isolate the virus in these very sick people to be absolutely certain that they actually are suffering from SARS-CoV-2, not from some other cause of pneumonia, for example, or the flu, and maybe then have a false positive test? They don't have truly symptoms truly consistent with SARS-CoV-2.
And when you talk about that, then there's also the bias that I would say that the virus is real. And when I say it like that, it's because there are some doctors and researchers that have claimed that the virus hasn't been isolated. And so, we have work on that on our website, and I can put that link down at the bottom for people to find that out and look for themselves. But so then it questions then the whole PCR test. What are they finding? And so how about we pick that up on the next conversation? Because there's a lot to cover here. Okay. Thank you very much, Barry.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, everybody.